The auction block stood in the merciless August sun of Hawthorne, Kansas, a trading post town that existed somewhere between civilization and lawlessness in the year 1873. And 15-year-old Daisy Garrett knew her life was about to change forever, as rough hands pushed her forward onto the splintered wooden platform. The men below leered up at her with eyes that held nothing resembling kindness, their faces weathered and cruel beneath wide-brimmed hats that offered no shade to the trembling girl, whose own father had just sold her to settle his gambling debts. She tried to make herself smaller, wrapping thin arms around her cotton dress that had seen better days, focusing on a distant point beyond the crowd where the prairie grass met the endless blue sky. Among the crowd stood a young ranch hand named Rhett Jamison, barely 21 himself, who had come to town only to pick up supplies for the Double Bar Ranch where he worked. He had no intention of participating in anything as vile as a human auction, and the sight of it turned his stomach. His jaw clenched as he watched the auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth, begin his repulsive pitch about the girl's qualities as though she were livestock. Rhett's hands balled into fists at his sides, his conscience warring with his practical mind that told him he had barely enough money to his name to matter. The bidding started low, and Rhett felt bile rise in his throat as he recognized some of the men throwing out numbers. There was Samuel Crenshaw, known throughout the territory for his cruelty to the women who worked in his saloon. There was Dutch Henry, an outlaw who operated just outside the law's reach. These men would destroy whatever innocence remained in the terrified girl on that platform. Rhett had seen what happened to young women in this town when they had no protection, no one to speak for them. Before his rational mind could stop him, Rhett heard his own voice calling out a bid that emptied his entire savings, and then some. He would have to borrow against his future wages, would be eating beans for months, but he could not walk away. Every eye in the crowd turned to look at him, some surprised, others calculating. Samuel Crenshaw glared at him with open hostility, clearly not appreciating the competition from a common ranch hand. The bidding continued, climbing higher than Rhett could possibly afford. His heart sank as the numbers rose beyond his reach. He was about to lose to Crenshaw when an older man beside him, a rancher named Thomas Mercer, who Rhett had once helped rescue from a flash flood, leaned over and whispered that he would loan him whatever was needed. Rhett looked at him in shock, but Thomas just nodded solemnly, understanding passing between them without further words, with Thomas backing him. Rhett continued bidding until finally, blessedly, the other men dropped out, unwilling to pay such an inflated price. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo across the plains, and just like that, Daisy Garrett belonged to Rhett Jamison in the eyes of the law and everyone present. The reality of what he had just done hit Rhett like a physical blow. He had just purchased a human being. The fact that his intentions were honorable did not change the fundamental wrongness of it. Daisy was brought down from the platform by rough hands that she flinched away from, her eyes downcast, refusing to look at the man who had bought her. Rhett approached slowly, hands held loosely at his sides in what he hoped was a non-threatening manner. Up close, he could see she was trembling, her dark hair falling around a face that was too pale, too thin. There were shadows under her green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and tears shed in silence. "Miss Garrett," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the dispersing crowd. She did not respond, did not even look up. He tried again. "My name is Rhett Jamison. I work at the Double Bar Ranch about 10 miles west of here. I know you have no reason to trust me or any man right now, but I want you to know that I will not hurt you. I will not touch you. You have my word." Still no response. Rhett exchanged glances with Thomas, who was settling up the payment with the auctioneer and Daisy's father, a thin man with hollow eyes who would not even look at his daughter as he pocketed the money. Rhett felt fresh anger surge through him but pushed it down. Anger would not help the frightened girl before him. "I have a wagon just over there," Rhett continued, keeping his voice gentle. "I would like to take you somewhere safe, where you can have a proper meal and a place to sleep. Would that be all right?" Daisy finally lifted her eyes to his, and what he saw there nearly broke his heart. There was no hope in those eyes, no expectation of kindness or mercy. She had already resigned herself to whatever horror she believed awaited her. She gave the smallest nod, more of a flinch than actual agreement, and Rhett took it as permission to lead the way to his wagon. The ride out to the Double Bar Ranch was silent except for the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Rhett made a few attempts at conversation but quickly realized that Daisy was not ready to talk. She sat as far from him as possible on the wagon bench, her body angled away, hands clutched together in her lap so tightly her knuckles were white. He let the silence stretch, hoping it would be less frightening than forced pleasantries. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The Double Bar was a modest operation run by a widow named Margaret Foster, who had taken over after her husband died of fever 3 years prior. She was a practical woman in her 50s, weathered by hard work, but kind-hearted beneath her no-nonsense exterior. Rhett had been counting on her kindness now. He helped Daisy down from the wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary, and led her toward the main house. Margaret emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression curious, until she took in the sight of the trembling girl. Her face transformed from curiosity to understanding to righteous anger in the span of seconds. "Rhett Jamison, please tell me you did not just bring home a girl from that God-forsaken auction," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I could not leave her there, Mrs. Foster," Rhett replied quietly. "Samuel Crenshaw was bidding on her. You know what that would have meant." Margaret's expression softened marginally. She approached Daisy with the same careful manner one might use with a wounded animal, stopping a respectful distance away. "Child, what is your name?" "Daisy," came the whisper, so quiet they almost missed it. "Daisy. That is a lovely name. I am Margaret Foster, and this is my ranch. You are welcome here for as long as you need. Are you hungry, dear?" A slight nod. "Then let us get you inside and fed. Rhett, you go see to the horses and then come back for supper. We have things to discuss." Rhett did as he was told, grateful for Margaret's intervention. He had no idea how to handle this situation, had acted purely on instinct in town, and now had to face the consequences of his impulsive decision. He owed Thomas Mercer a substantial amount of money. He had a traumatized young girl who was legally bound to him in a way that made his skin crawl. And he had no plan whatsoever for how to move forward. By the time he returned to the house, Daisy was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of stew in front of her, eating slowly. Margaret was at the stove, but she fixed Rhett with a pointed look as he entered. He took a seat at the opposite end of the table from Daisy, maintaining as much distance as possible. "I have explained to Daisy that she will be staying in the spare room off the kitchen," Margaret announced. "It has a lock on the door, which she may use as she sees fit. She will help me with household tasks, for which she will receive fair wages. You, Rhett Jamison, will be drawing up papers to free her from this despicable arrangement as soon as we can get to a lawyer." Relief flooded through Rhett. "Yes, madam. That was my intention." "Your intention does not change the fact that you participated in a human auction," Margaret said sharply. though I suppose your heart was in the right place, even if your head was not thinking clearly." "No, madam, it was not," Rhett admitted, "but I could not let Crenshaw have her. Or Dutch Henry. They were both bidding." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then perhaps you did the only thing you could. We shall sort this mess out properly." Over the following days, a fragile routine established itself at the Double Bar Ranch. Daisy worked alongside Margaret in the house and garden, speaking rarely but following instructions carefully. Rhett kept his distance as promised, limiting his interactions with Daisy to polite greetings when their paths crossed. He worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tending cattle, and doing whatever jobs needed doing to justify his wages and begin repaying his debt to Thomas Mercer. It was 2 weeks before the next trip to town, where Rhett and Margaret met with the only lawyer in Hawthorne, a shrewd man named Gerald Patterson. They explained the situation, and Patterson drew up the necessary papers to grant Daisy her freedom. The process was surprisingly simple on paper, though Rhett knew the reality was more complicated. Where would Daisy go? What would she do? A young woman alone had few options in this territory, most of them grim. When they returned to the ranch and presented Daisy with the papers, she stared at them for a long moment, uncomprehending. Margaret had to explain twice that she was free, that she owed Rhett nothing, that she could leave whenever she wished. Tears welled in Daisy's eyes, the first real emotion Rhett had seen from her beyond fear. "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You may stay here as long as you like," Margaret said firmly. "I could use the help, and you are a quick learner. The wages I mentioned before stand. You will earn your keep fairly." Daisy looked between Margaret and Rhett, seeming to search for the trap, the hidden cruelty. When she found none, she nodded slowly, clutching the papers to her chest like they were precious beyond measure. As summer faded into autumn, the tension in Daisy's shoulders began to ease, though she still startled at sudden movements and kept her distance from Rhett. He did not take it personally. He could not imagine what she had endured, both before the auction and in the years leading up to it. Her trust would have to be earned slowly, if it could be earned at all. Rhett found himself watching her sometimes when he thought she would not notice. The way she hummed softly while hanging laundry, the gentle manner in which she fed the chickens, the small smile that occasionally graced her features when Margaret told a story over supper. She was healing slowly, and something about witnessing that transformation stirred unfamiliar feelings in his chest. He tried to ignore those feelings. The last thing Daisy needed was another man with expectations or desires. She needed safety, stability, and time. Rhett was determined to give her all three, even if it meant keeping his growing affection locked away indefinitely. One October evening, as Rhett was returning from checking on the cattle in the south pasture, he heard a scream from the direction of the barn. His blood turned to ice. He spurred his horse into a gallop, reaching the barn in seconds, his hand on his revolver. He found Daisy pressed against the far wall, eyes wide with terror, and a large rattlesnake coiled between her and the door. "Don't move," Rhett said quietly, dismounting slowly. The snake's rattle was a dry, ominous sound in the dimming light. Daisy was frozen, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. Rhett circled wide, drawing the snake's attention to himself. In one smooth motion, he drew his gun and fired, the shot echoing across the ranch. The snake's head separated from its body, the threat ended. Daisy collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit on the barn floor, shaking uncontrollably. Rhett holstered his gun and approached carefully, crouching a few feet away from her. "It's all right now. You are safe. It is dead." "I thought," she gasped between shaking breaths, "I thought I was going to die." "You are safe," Rhett repeated. I will not let anything hurt you." Something shifted in that moment. Daisy looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since he had bought her freedom. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy some unspoken question because she nodded slowly, her breathing beginning to even out. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are welcome, Daisy." From that day forward, things were different. Daisy no longer flinched quite so much when Rhett entered a room. She began to speak to him at meals, tentative at first, but gradually with more confidence. She asked him about his work, about the cattle, about how he had come to work at the double bar. He answered honestly, telling her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, about drifting west in search of a new start. In turn, she began to share fragments of her own story. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father had turned to gambling and drinking to cope with the loss, and had dragged Daisy deeper into poverty with each passing year. She had been forced to leave school to take in washing and mending, trying desperately to keep food on the table. When her father's debts had grown too large, he had made the choice that had brought her to that auction block. Rhett listened to all of this with a growing sense of protectiveness and rage at the injustices this young woman had suffered. But he kept his anger in check, knowing she needed his calm strength more than his fury. As winter approached, bringing cold winds and early snow to the Kansas prairie, the household at the double bar settled into comfortable rhythms. Margaret had taken Daisy under her wing like a daughter, teaching her everything from cooking to basic reading and arithmetic. Daisy absorbed it all eagerly, hungry for knowledge and skills that had been denied to her. Rhett found excuses to be near her. He would repair things that did not strictly need repairing in the house. He would linger over meals, contributing to conversations that stretched longer each night. He brought her small gifts, nothing that could be construed as courting, just tokens of thoughtfulness. A book he had ordered from town when she mentioned wanting to read better. A warm shawl when the temperatures dropped. A jar of honey from a trader who had passed through. Margaret noticed, of course. One evening after Daisy had retired to her room, the older woman fixed Rhett with a knowing look over her mending. "You have feelings for her." It was not a question. Rhett considered denying it but saw no point. "Yes, madam, but I would never act on them. She has been through enough." "She has," Margaret agreed. "But she is healing, Rhett, and she is not blind. I see the way she watches you when she thinks no one is looking." Hope flared in Rhett's chest before he ruthlessly tamped it down. "Even if that were true, it is too soon. She is only 16 now. I will wait. For as long as it takes." "You are a good man, Rhett Jamison," Margaret said softly. "Better than most." The winter passed slowly, each day blending into the next in a peaceful monotony that was balm to Daisy's wounded spirit. She grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. Her frame filled out with regular meals, and her smiles came more readily. She laughed at Rhett's stories, teased him gently when he tracked mud into the clean kitchen, and sought his opinion on things she was learning. For his part, Rhett fell deeper in love with each passing day. It was not just Daisy's physical beauty, though she was lovely with her dark hair and green eyes. It was her resilience, her kindness despite all she had suffered, the way she sang to the animals, the fierce concentration on her face when she was learning something new. He loved all of it, and he kept it to himself, content to be near her even if nothing more ever came of it. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers across the prairie and new calves in the pastures. Daisy was 17 now, more confident in her skills and her place at the ranch. She had taken over most of the cooking, discovering a talent for it that pleased her enormously. She tended a vegetable garden that was already showing promise, and she had begun helping Margaret with the ranch accounts, her arithmetic skills improving rapidly. One afternoon in May, Rhett was working on replacing a section of fence when Daisy appeared carrying a canteen of water and a cloth-wrapped bundle. She had not brought him refreshments in the field before, and his heart stuttered at the sight of her picking her way across the meadow. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said, offering the canteen with a smile that made his mouth go dry for reasons that had nothing to do with thirst. "Thank you," he managed, taking a long drink. The water was cool and sweet. "This was thoughtful of you." "I also brought some bread and cheese," she said, unwrapping the bundle. "You left before having a proper midday meal." They sat together on a fallen log, eating in companionable silence for a while. Rhett was acutely aware of her proximity, the way the spring breeze caught strands of her hair, the curve of her smile when she noticed a rabbit hopping through the distant grass. "Rhett," she said suddenly, her voice serious, "may I ask you something? Anything? Why did you buy me that day?" "The real reason." He set down his bread, considering his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, tangled up in his feelings for her now, but she deserved honesty. "Because I could not walk away. I saw what those other men were, what they would have done to you. And I knew I would never be able to live with myself if I did not at least try to help, even if it meant going into debt, even if it was presumptuous and possibly made things worse. I just could not leave you there." Daisy was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the horizon. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "You gave me my life back, my freedom, my hope. I do not know if I have ever properly thanked you for that." "You do not owe me thanks, Daisy. You do not owe me anything." "I know," she said, turning to look at him with an intensity that took his breath away. "That is why I want to give it. You have been nothing but kind and respectful and patient with me. You have never asked for anything in return. You have treated me like I matter, like I am worth something." "You are worth everything," Rhett said before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Daisy's eyes widened slightly, color rising in her cheeks. "Rhett, I need to tell you something. These past months, watching you, talking with you, I have come to care for you, as more than just the man who saved me, as more than a friend." Rhett's heart was pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it. "Daisy, I care for you too, more than I can properly express. But I do not want you to feel obligated. I do not want you to think you owe me anything because of what happened." "I do not feel obligated," she said firmly. "I feel grateful, yes, but what I feel for you goes beyond gratitude. I think about you constantly. I look forward to seeing you each day. When you smile at me, I feel warm all over. Is that obligation, or is that something else?" "That sounds like something else entirely," Rhett admitted, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Daisy, I have loved you for months now, but I did not want to say anything. You are so young and you have been through so much. I wanted to give you time to heal, to be sure of what you wanted." "I am sure," Daisy said, reaching out to take his hand. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him, and the contact sent electricity through his entire body. "I am 17, Rhett. I am old enough to know my own heart, and my heart wants you." Rhett turned on the log to face her fully, bringing his other hand up to gently cup her cheek. She leaned into his touch rather than pulling away, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "I want to court you properly," he said. "With Margaret's permission, I want to do this right." "Then ask her," Daisy said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Because I want this too." That evening, Rhett formally asked Margaret for permission to court Daisy. The older woman had laughed, saying she had been wondering how long it would take him to work up the courage. She gave her blessing readily, with the caveat that everything would be done properly and respectfully. Rhett assured her that he would not have it any other way. The courtship that followed was sweet and unhurried. Rhett brought Daisy flowers from the prairie. They took walks in the evening, talking about everything and nothing. He taught her to ride horseback properly, patient when she was nervous, encouraging when she grew confident. She taught him to dance, laughing as they stumbled through steps in the kitchen while Margaret hummed a tune. Slowly, carefully, Daisy learned to trust in Rhett's affection. She learned that his touches were gentle, his kisses sweet and respectful, his words sincere. The fear that had shadowed her began to dissipate, replaced by joy and anticipation for the future. Rhett fell more deeply in love with each passing day, marveling at his good fortune. This woman who had every reason to be broken had instead chosen to heal, to hope, to love. She was the strongest person he had ever known, and he counted himself blessed beyond measure that she had chosen him. As summer arrived once more, marking nearly a year since that fateful day in Hawthorne, Rhett knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Daisy. He began saving what little money he could, planning for a future together. He spoke with Thomas Mercer about eventually buying a small piece of land where he could build a home. Thomas, who had been repaid in full for his loan, was enthusiastic about the idea and offered to sell Rhett a parcel on the edge of his property at a fair price. One evening in late July, Rhett asked Daisy to walk with him to a spot overlooking the prairie where the sunset painted the entire world in gold and crimson. They sat together on a blanket he had brought, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Daisy," he said quietly, his heart thundering in his chest, "I know we have not been courting long in the traditional sense, but I have loved you for a year now, since the day I first saw you. Every day with you is a gift. Every smile you give me is a treasure. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Daisy lifted her head to look at him, her eyes already shining with tears. "Rhett." He shifted to kneel before her, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. It had belonged to his mother, one of the few possessions he still had from his life before. "Daisy Garrett, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Rhett, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, laughing and crying at once, and he was holding her close, kissing her hair, her forehead, her lips. The sunset blazed around them, bearing witness to their joy. They were married in September, in a small ceremony in Hawthorne with Margaret, Thomas Mercer, and a handful of friends from the surrounding ranches in attendance. Daisy wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her make, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Rhett wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed within an inch of their life. The local preacher, a kind man named Reverend Walsh, performed the ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, Rhett kissed Daisy with all the love and tenderness he possessed, and she kissed him back without hesitation or fear. It was a moment of pure happiness, untainted by the darkness of the past. They spent their wedding night in the small house Rhett had been building on the land purchased from Thomas. It was modest, just 3 rooms, but it was theirs. Rhett carried Daisy over the threshold, both of them laughing, giddy with joy and the newness of being husband and wife. That night, Rhett was patient and gentle, letting Daisy set the pace, attuned to her every reaction. She trusted him completely, had chosen him freely, and the intimacy they shared was beautiful and right. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair, talking in quiet voices about their future until sleep claimed them both. The first year of their marriage was filled with hard work and simple pleasures. They worked together to make their little homestead thrive, planting crops, raising chickens, and adding a milk cow. Rhett continued working part-time for Thomas Mercer, building up their savings. Daisy took in sewing and sold eggs and butter in town, contributing to their income and taking pride in her independence. They made frequent visits to Margaret, who had become like a mother to them both. The older woman delighted in their happiness, often remarking that she had never seen two people more suited to each other. She taught Daisy more advanced cooking techniques and shared Margaret's late husband's knowledge of ranching, which Daisy absorbed eagerly and relayed to Rhett. In the spring of the following year, Daisy discovered she was with child. The news filled them both with a mixture of joy and trepidation. They were young, still establishing their homestead, but they were also deeply in love and ready for this next chapter. Margaret was over the moon at the news, immediately beginning to knit tiny garments and offering advice about childbirth and motherhood. Thomas Mercer gave Rhett a raise and more flexible hours as the pregnancy progressed. The entire community seemed to embrace the young couple and their growing family. Daisy bloomed during her pregnancy, her happiness evident in everything she did. Rhett was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, which Daisy tolerated with patient amusement. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He added a room onto their house for the nursery. He read to her in the evenings from books they borrowed from the traveling library that came through quarterly. As her time drew near, Rhett became increasingly anxious. The dangers of childbirth were very real, and he could not bear the thought of losing Daisy. She reassured him constantly, her faith in the outcome far steadier than his. Margaret promised to be there for the birth, as would the local midwife, a capable woman named Esther Cunningham. On a warm October evening, 2 years after their marriage and 3 years after the day Rhett had first seen Daisy on that auction block, Daisy went into labor. Rhett rode like the wind to fetch Margaret and Esther, then spent the longest night of his life pacing the kitchen floor while the women attended to Daisy in the bedroom. Dawn was breaking when he finally heard the sound he had been desperately waiting for, the cry of a newborn baby. Moments later, Margaret emerged with a smile on her tired face. "You have a son, Rhett, and Daisy is well." Rhett nearly collapsed with relief. He was allowed into the bedroom where Daisy lay propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. He approached slowly, awestruck, and gazed down at his son's small red face, the tiny fingers curled into fists. "He is perfect," Rhett whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You are perfect. Thank you, Daisy, thank you. We made him together," Daisy said softly, her own eyes wet. "Our little miracle. What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly over the past months but had never quite settled on one. Looking at his son now, Rhett suddenly knew. "James, after your mother's father, James Jamison." Daisy's smile was brilliant through her tears. "James." "It is perfect." Little James proved to be a healthy, happy baby with a good set of lungs and an appetite to match. Rhett discovered depths of love he had never known existed, marveling at the tiny person he and Daisy had created together. Fatherhood suited him, though the sleepless nights were challenging. He would walk the floor with James in the wee hours, singing the lullabies his own mother had sung to him, overwhelmed by the responsibility and privilege of raising this child. Daisy took to motherhood naturally, her protective instincts fierce and her patience seemingly endless. Watching her nurse their son, seeing the tender way she cradled him, Rhett fell in love with her all over again. She had survived so much, overcome such trauma, and now she was giving their son all the love and security she herself had been denied for too long. As James grew from infant to toddler, the Jamison homestead continued to prosper. Rhett and Thomas Mercer had formed a partnership of sorts, combining their cattle herds and sharing grazing land. The arrangement benefited both families and solidified the friendship between the two men. Rhett had also begun breeding horses, a venture that showed significant promise. When James was 2, Daisy announced she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, perhaps because she was chasing a rambunctious toddler and had less time to worry. Rhett was no less anxious but better at hiding it, having learned that his fretting only made Daisy laugh at him. Their second child, a daughter they named Alina after Rhett's mother, arrived on a spring morning amid a chorus of birdsong. She was smaller than James had been, with a shock of dark hair and her mother's green eyes. Rhett held her with shaking hands, this tiny daughter, and promised her silently that he would protect her always, that she would never know the suffering her mother had endured. With 2 young children, life became busier and more chaotic. The house rang with laughter and crying, with the patter of small feet and the constant questions of a curious toddler. Rhett built additions onto the house as they could afford it, slowly expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. Daisy managed the household with skill, somehow keeping everyone fed and clothed despite the limited resources and endless demands on her time. Margaret remained a constant presence in their lives, doting on her honorary grandchildren and providing Daisy with support and friendship. Thomas Mercer, who had never married, seemed to adopt the Jamison family as his own, always available with advice or assistance when needed. The years passed in a blur of hard work and precious moments. James started school in Hawthorne, riding into town each day with Rhett, who had business there selling horses and cattle. Alina proved to be a spirited child, fearless and stubborn, keeping her parents on their toes. 2 more children followed, a son named Robert and another daughter named Grace, spacing the siblings roughly 2 years apart. Through it all, Rhett and Daisy's love for each other only deepened. They had weathered hardships together, droughts that threatened their crops, harsh winters that killed livestock, illnesses that swept through the territory. They had also celebrated triumphs, successful harvests, horses sold for good prices, children reaching milestones. Every challenge faced together had strengthened their bond. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit together on the porch Rhett had built, watching the sunset paint the prairie sky. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and dreams and plans. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, drawing strength from each other's presence. "You ever think about that day in Hawthorne?" Daisy asked one such evening. The children were older now, James nearly 12, Alina 10, Robert 8, and Grace 6. "The day we met, sometimes," Rhett admitted, "though it seems like another lifetime ago, another world." "I was so scared," Daisy said quietly. "I thought my life was over. I thought there was nothing ahead of me but suffering." Rhett brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I am sorry you had to endure that fear, even for a day." "I am not," Daisy said, surprising him. When he looked at her questioningly, she continued, "If that day had not happened, we might never have found each other. I would not have this life, this family. You gave me time to heal, space to find myself again. You waited until I was ready to trust, to love. Not every man would have done that." "You were worth waiting for," Rhett said simply. "You are worth everything." They sat in silence for a moment, then Daisy spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "I want our daughters to never know what it is like to be powerless. I want them to grow up strong and educated, able to make their own choices. I want our sons to grow up knowing how to treat women with respect, to see them as equals. I want them to be like you." "They will be," Rhett promised. "We will raise them right together. They will know they are loved, that they are valued. They will know how to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Look how far we have come." Daisy mused, her eyes on the horizon where the last light was fading. From that horrible day to this beautiful life, sometimes I can hardly believe it is real. It is real, Rhett assured her, pulling her close. And it is ours. We built this together. As their children grew, Rhett and Daisy made good on their promises. They ensured all 4 children received solid educations, even the girls, which was unusual for the time and place. They taught them the value of hard work, the importance of kindness, and the courage to stand against injustice. They shared age-appropriate versions of their own story, wanting the children to understand where they had come from and why certain values were so important to their parents. James grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's sense of justice and his mother's compassion. He talked about becoming a lawyer, wanting to help people who could not help themselves. Rhett and Daisy encouraged this dream, already setting aside money for his education back east. Eleanor inherited her mother's resilience and her father's determination. She was brilliant with horses and announced her intention to run the family breeding business when she was old enough. Rhett had no doubt she would do exactly that, and do it well. Robert was quiet and observant, spending hours helping his mother in her garden and learning about growing things. He talked about having his own farm someday, about sustainability and crop rotation, concepts he learned from books and discussions with his parents. Grace, the youngest, was a whirlwind of energy and creativity. She drew constantly, filling pages with sketches of the prairie, the animals, her family. Daisy nurtured this talent, ordering art supplies when they could afford them and encouraging Grace to see the beauty in the world around her. Margaret lived to see all 4 children half-grown before passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Her death was a profound loss for the entire family. She had been grandmother, mentor, and friend. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the Double Bar Ranch, which she had left to Rhett and Daisy in her will, having no children of her own. The inheritance meant the Jamison family now owned substantial land and a considerable cattle herd. It was a responsibility they took seriously, managing both their own homestead and the Double Bar with care and foresight. Thomas Mercer, now in his 70s, helped when he could but was slowing down, and Rhett gradually took over more of the day-to-day operations. As Rhett and Daisy entered their 40s, they looked back on their life together with deep satisfaction. They had built something lasting and good from the ashes of trauma and injustice. Their marriage was strong, their children thriving, their homestead prosperous. They had become pillars of the Hawthorne community, known for their fairness in business dealings and their generosity to those in need. Daisy had become particularly involved in helping young women in difficult situations, offering employment and shelter when she could, advocating for their rights when the opportunity arose. She never forgot what it was like to be powerless, and used her position to lift up others whenever possible. Rhett supported these efforts wholeheartedly, often contributing his own time and resources to the causes Daisy championed. One afternoon, nearly 25 years after that day in Hawthorne, a young woman appeared at their door, thin and frightened, having heard that the Jamisons helped people in trouble. She was 18, fleeing an arranged marriage to a much older man who frightened her. Daisy took one look at the terror in the girl's eyes and invited her in without hesitation. Over supper that evening, the young woman, whose name was Catherine, told her story. Rhett and Daisy exchanged glances across the table, both remembering a different frightened girl from long ago. They offered Catherine work and shelter, helping her write to distant relatives who might take her in, giving her time and space to figure out her next steps. Watching Daisy comfort Catherine, seeing her offer the same compassion and protection she herself had once received, Rhett felt his heart swell with pride and love. This woman, who had survived so much, who had healed against all odds, was using her pain to prevent others from suffering. She had transformed her trauma into strength that she now shared freely with those who needed it. That night, after Catherine was settled in the guest room and the house was quiet, Rhett found Daisy standing on the porch, looking out at the moonlit prairie. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into his embrace with the trust and comfort of long familiarity. "You are thinking about the past," he said softly. "I am thinking about how that frightened girl from Hawthorne became this woman," Daisy replied. "How she survived and found love and built a family. How she learned to trust again because one good man was patient enough to wait." "You did the surviving," Rhett reminded her. "I just provided safe harbor while you healed." "You did so much more than that," Daisy insisted, turning in his arms to face him. "You showed me what love could be, what marriage could be when it was built on respect and genuine affection. You gave me back my life, Rhett, my freedom, my hope. And then you gave me this beautiful life we have built together. And you gave me purpose," Rhett said, touching his forehead to hers. "You gave me a family, a home, a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be. I love you, Daisy. I have loved you from nearly the beginning, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Daisy whispered. "My rescuer, my friend, my partner, my love." They kissed in the moonlight, a sweet reunion of souls that had found each other against all odds and chosen to build something beautiful together. The years continued to unfold, bringing the inevitable changes that time delivers. James did indeed go east to study law, returning 5 years later with a degree and a quiet determination to fight for justice in the territory. He set up practice in Hawthorne, quickly gaining a reputation for taking cases others would not touch, for defending the defenseless. Rhett and Daisy could not have been prouder. Eleanor took over the horse breeding operation as she had planned, expanding it beyond what Rhett had ever imagined. She had an eye for bloodlines and a gift for training that made the Jamison horses sought after throughout Kansas and beyond. She married a fellow horse breeder, a respectful man who treated her as an equal partner in both business and life. Robert did start his own farm on a portion of the family land, implementing innovative techniques he had learned from agricultural journals and his own experimentation. His farm became a model of sustainability, and he wrote articles sharing his methods with other farmers. He married a school teacher, and together they raised crops and children with equal care and attention. Grace's artistic talents blossomed as she matured. Her sketches evolved into paintings that captured the beauty and harshness of prairie life with startling accuracy. She eventually moved to Denver to study formally, though she returned home frequently, always finding inspiration in the land where she had grown up. She never married, declaring herself wedded to her art, and her family respected her choice. As grandchildren began to arrive, Rhett and Daisy found new joy in watching the next generation grow. They were active grandparents, teaching the children to ride, telling them stories, instilling in them the values that had guided their own lives. The family gatherings were loud and chaotic and filled with love. Thomas Mercer passed away at the age of 84, having lived long enough to see the Jamison family flourish. He left his portion of the combined ranch operation to Rhett, saying in his will that he could think of no better steward for the land he had loved. Rhett and Daisy ensured he was buried next to Margaret on that hillside, bringing together in death the two people who had meant so much to them. As Rhett and Daisy grew older, their love remained constant. Their hair grayed, their hands became gnarled from decades of hard work, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their bond had been tested by time and hardship, and had only grown stronger. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Rhett stood to make a toast. His voice was still strong despite his 61 years. 40 years ago, I married the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I had ever known. She had every reason to give up on life, on hope, on love. But she chose to fight. She chose to heal. And somehow, miraculously, she chose me. Every day since has been a gift. Daisy, you are the love of my life, my partner in all things, my greatest blessing. Here is to 40 more years. Daisy, her eyes bright with happy tears, raised her glass. To the man who saw me when I was invisible, who valued me when I felt worthless, who waited patiently while I learned to trust again. You are my hero, Rhett Jamison. You always have been. I love you today as much as I did when we married, perhaps more. Here is to the rest of our lives together, however long that may be. The celebration that followed was joyous, filled with music and dancing and stories shared across generations. As evening fell and the party wound down, Rhett and Daisy slipped away to their favorite spot, the porch where they had spent countless evenings over the decades. We made it, Daisy said softly, taking his hand. Against all odds, we made it. We did, Rhett agreed, bringing her hand to his lips in the gesture that had become second nature over the years. We built a good life, Daisy, a life filled with love and purpose. We raised good children who are raising good children. We made a difference. Because you gave me the chance, Daisy said. Because you waited until I was ready. Because you loved me enough to let me heal at my own pace. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done, Rhett said. The honor of my life. They sat together as the stars emerged one by one in the vast Kansas sky, hands intertwined, hearts beating in sync after 40 years of marriage. The prairie stretched out before them, the land they had worked and loved and passed on to their children. In the house behind them, their family laughed and talked, the sound of their legacy continuing into the future. Daisy rested her head on Rhett's shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to her hair, silver now but still soft. They had started as strangers brought together by circumstance, one broken and one determined to help. They had become friends, then lovers, then spouses, then parents and grandparents. Through it all, their love had been the foundation upon which everything else was built. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Rhett and Daisy gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranches and businesses, trusting their children and grandchildren to carry on. They spent their days in simple pleasures, tending a small garden, reading together, visiting with family and friends, watching the seasons change over the prairie they loved. When Rhett developed a persistent cough in his 72nd year, the doctor in Hawthorne diagnosed it as a chronic condition that would only worsen with time. Rhett accepted this news with equanimity, more concerned about how Daisy would manage without him than about his own mortality. They talked honestly about the future, making plans and saying things that needed to be said, though their love had always been evident in both words and deeds. Daisy nursed him through the gradual decline, with the same fierce devotion she had shown in all things. She refused to let him give up, insisting on quality of life even as his health failed. They still sat on the porch each evening when weather permitted, still held hands, still shared the comfortable silence of souls that knew each other completely. One spring evening, surrounded by family in the home he had built with his own hands, Rhett Jamison passed peacefully from this life to the next. Daisy was holding his hand when he drew his last breath, and though her heart shattered, she took comfort in knowing he had lived a full life, that he had been loved deeply, that his legacy would continue through their children and grandchildren. The entire community of Hawthorne turned out for Rhett's funeral. He had been a good man, fair in his dealings, generous with those in need, a pillar of the community for over 50 years. But for Daisy, he had been so much more. He had been her savior, her partner, her love. He had seen her at her lowest point and had chosen to help without expectation of reward. He had waited patiently while she healed, had loved her without reservation, had built a beautiful life alongside her. Daisy lived another 8 years after Rhett's death, finding purpose in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the causes she had championed, in preserving the legacy she and Rhett had built together. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already had the love of her life and needed no other. She spent her final years recording the story of her life, wanting future generations to know where they had come from, the struggles that had been overcome, the love that had made everything possible. She wrote about the auction block and the fear, about Rhett's unexpected kindness, about the slow journey to trust and love. She wrote about their marriage, their children, their life together on the Kansas prairie. When Daisy Jamison passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80, she was surrounded by 4 generations of family, all of whom existed because a young cowboy had once made the impulsive decision to save a frightened girl from a terrible fate, and then had the patience and love to wait until she was ready to trust again. They buried her next to Rhett on the hillside overlooking the land they had loved, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and the dates that bracketed their remarkable lives. But their true legacy was not in stone. It was in the descendants who carried their values forward, in the businesses they had built that still operated on principles of fairness and integrity, in the countless lives they had touched through their generosity and compassion. The story of Rhett and Daisy Jamison became part of Hawthorne's history, passed down through generations as an example of love conquering hardship, of patience rewarded, of 2 souls finding each other against impossible odds. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can survive. That healing is possible. That love, true love built on respect and trust and partnership, can transform lives. Their great-granddaughter, named Daisy after her beloved ancestor, would eventually write a book about their lives, ensuring the story reached beyond Hawthorne to inspire others. In the introduction, she wrote, "My great-grandmother was sold at 15, stripped of her dignity and freedom by circumstances beyond her control. My great-grandfather was a young cowboy with more heart than money who could not stand by and watch injustice unfold. He bought her freedom and then gave her something even more precious: time to heal, space to grow, and love without conditions. He waited until she was ready to trust again. And when she was ready, they built a love story for the ages, a partnership that lasted over 50 years and created a legacy that continues to this day. This is their story. This is how love should be." The little house that Rhett had built with his own hands still stood over a century later, preserved by the family as a reminder of humble beginnings and extraordinary love. Visitors could see the room where 4 children had been born, the kitchen where countless meals had been shared, the porch where 2 souls had spent countless evenings watching the sunset over the prairie they called home. In that house, in that story, in that enduring legacy, the truth remained clear. Love is not about ownership or obligation. Love is about choice, freely given and freely received. Love is about patience and respect, about seeing another person's pain and choosing to help them heal rather than exploit their vulnerability. Love is about building something together, day by day, year by year, until a lifetime has passed and you can look back with satisfaction at what you created together. Rhett and Daisy Jamison knew this truth and lived it fully. From the ashes of trauma and injustice, they built a love that transformed not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Their story was one of hope, healing, patience, and the transformative power of genuine love. It was a story that began on an auction block in Hawthorne, Kansas, in 1873 and rippled forward through generations, a testament to the truth that even in the darkest times, love can light the way home.